America has always been a land of dreamers, hustlers, and opportunists, but hidden in the shadows of its ambition are some of the most bizarre, audacious con artists the world has ever seen. These weren't just ordinary liars or petty thieves. They were master manipulators who wove elaborate lies so strange, so outrageous, that they blurred the line between reality and pure fiction. Imagine a woman who convinced thousands she was a long-lost princess, or a man who sold shares in a city that didn't exist. These weren't just scams, they were full-blown spectacles fueled by greed, gullibility, and a touch of sheer madness. And today, we're diving headfirst into 30 of the weirdest, most unforgettable cases in American history. From the golden age of snake oil salesmen peddling miracle cures made of nothing but alcohol and hope, to modern-day impostors who walked into high society parties and walked out with fortunes, these stories are as entertaining as they are unbelievable. What drives someone to invent an entire identity or convince people to invest in an invisible invention? It's not just about the money, it's about the thrill of the game, the power of persuasion, and sometimes the sheer audacity to keep a straight face while selling absolute nonsense. These con artists didn't just cheat their victims, they fooled the entire country, leaving behind legacies so strange, you'll wonder how anyone ever fell for them. But here's the thing, these stories aren't just about deception. They're a mirror held up to human nature itself, our desperation for miracles, our trust in charisma, and our willingness to believe in something too good to be true. Some of these scams were so elaborate they changed laws, inspired movies, and even shaped entire industries. And as we unravel each one, you'll start to see the patterns, the charm, the big promises, and the moment everything crumbles into chaos. So buckle up, because this isn't just a list of liars and thieves. It's a journey through the strangest corners of American ambition, where the only rule was, if you can fake it well enough, you might just get away with it. Ferdinand Demara wasn't just a con artist, he was a chameleon, slipping into identities like they were costumes and fooling everyone around him with nothing but sheer confidence. Known as the Great Imposter, he didn't just fake a resume or forge a diploma, he became whoever he wanted to be, from a respected psychologist to a decorated naval officer, even a Benedictine monk. But his most jaw-dropping stunt, posing as a surgeon during the Korean War and actually performing life or death operations without a single day of medical school. It all started with stolen identities. Demara had a knack for finding talented professionals, lifting their credentials, and then stepping into their lives without hesitation. He studied their mannerisms, mastered their fields just enough to sound convincing, and leaned on his natural charisma to smooth over any doubts when he took on the identity of Dr. Joseph Sear, a real Canadian physician. No one batted an eye, not even the desperate military hospital that put him to work on wounded soldiers. With a medical manual tucked under his arm and a cool, authoritative demeanor, he performed surgeries, set broken bones, and even removed bullets. And here's the wildest part, his patients survived, but like all great cons, the cracks eventually showed. The real doctor, Sear's mother, saw a newspaper photo of her son in uniform and alerted the authorities. When Demara was exposed, the world couldn't decide whether to be horrified or impressed. How had he pulled it off? Blame it on a mix of wartime chaos, his gift for persuasion, and the sheer audacity of a man who believed he could do anything even if he'd never learned how. After his arrest, the military didn't even press charges, partly out of embarrassment, partly because his patients had thrived under his care. Demara's story isn't just about deception, it's about the power of illusion. He didn't just trick people, he made them want to believe in him. And in a way, he proved that confidence can sometimes be just as effective as competence, at least until the truth catches up. His legend lives on as a reminder that in the right hands, a lie isn't just a lie. It's a performance, and some people are born to play the part. Joseph Weil, better known as the Yellow Kid, didn't just run cons, he orchestrated full-scale theatrical productions where the Mark played the lead role without ever realizing it. Dapper, charming, and armed with an uncanny understanding of human greed, Weil became one of the most successful con artists of the early 20th century by perfecting schemes so elaborate they felt like Hollywood plots. His signature move, the wiretap con, a masterpiece of deception where victims were tricked into believing they could eavesdrop on insider stock tips only to lose their life savings in a rigged game. Weil's genius lay in his ability to exploit ambition. He'd lure wealthy businessmen into fake brokerage offices staffed with actors playing brokers, clerks, and even rival investors. The centerpiece was a phony telegraph machine, supposedly hacked to intercept stock market secrets. When the machine spat out tips predicting rising stocks, the Mark would pour money into sham investments, watching fake tickers show his fortune climbing until Weil and his crew vanished with the cash. The beauty of the scam, it preyed on the victim's own desire to cheat the system. As Weil famously said, "You can't con an honest man." But what set Weil apart wasn't just his technical skill, it was his flair for the dramatic. He dressed impeccably, dropped names of powerful figures, and staged distractions like sudden police raids to heighten tension. He even hired lookouts to pose as janitors or street vendors, ensuring the scene felt airtight. And unlike small-time hustlers, Weil targeted the wealthy elite, arguing that stealing from the greedy was almost a public service. His cons were so admired by other criminals that the wiretap became a template for decades of financial fraud. Yet for all his cunning, Weil's legacy is oddly philosophical. He viewed himself less as a thief and more as a mirror, reflecting society's hunger for easy money. After serving prison time later in life, he even gave interviews dissecting his methods, almost like a retired professor of grift. His story isn't just about the art of the con, it's a warning about the lies we tell ourselves when a deal seems too good to be true. Weil proved that the most dangerous scams aren't the ones that trick your wallet, but the ones that first trick your mind. Cassie Chadwick didn't just tell a lie, she built an empire on it, spinning a web of deception so elaborate that even the sharpest bankers of the Gilded Age fell for it. Her claim she was the secret illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in history. With nothing but audacity and a forged promissory note, she turned that fiction into a fortune, swindling banks out of millions while living like royalty. But her most brazen touch, the diamond-studded belt she wore during her arrest, as if mocking the very system she'd fooled. Chadwick's genius was in understanding power dynamics. She knew that in an era of booming industry and social climbing, no one wanted to question a woman with connections to Carnegie's vast wealth. So she planted rumors, dropped hints in high society circles, and even staged a dramatic private meeting with the tycoon in a hotel lobby, though the two had never actually spoken. The clincher was a fabricated promissory note for $7 million, supposedly signed by Carnegie, which she used as collateral to secure massive loans. Banks tripped over themselves to lend her money, terrified of offending the steel magnate by doubting his daughter, but Chadwick didn't stop at loans. She leaned into the role, hosting lavish parties, wearing extravagant jewels, and even hiring servants to reinforce her aristocratic illusion. The more she spent, the more credible she seemed. After all, who but Carnegie's heir could afford such decadence? Her downfall came when a suspicious bank clerk finally dug deeper and discovered the promissory note was a fake. When police arrested her in 2005, she greeted them in a gown and that infamous diamond belt, a symbol of the life she'd fabricated. The trial became a national spectacle, exposing how easily prestige could trump scrutiny. What makes Chadwick's story unforgettable isn't just the scale of her fraud, it's the sheer theatricality of it. She didn't just exploit greed, she weaponized social ambition, proving that sometimes the most powerful currency isn't money, but the perception of it. In a world desperate to believe in fairy tales, Cassie Chadwick didn't just con banks, She gave them a role in her fantasy, and they played it perfectly. At first glance, Maggie and Kate Fox seemed like ordinary farm girls from upstate New York, until the night they convinced their own family that their house was haunted. In 1848, the sisters, just 12 and 15 years old at the time, started a cultural earthquake with nothing but a few clever knocks under the table. Their spirit rappings, supposedly messages from the dead, weren't just a childhood prank. They sparked the spiritualism movement, a nationwide obsession that lasted decades and bilked millions from grieving families desperate to speak with lost loved ones. The Fox sisters' method was shockingly simple. They cracked their toe joints against wooden floors or furniture, producing mysterious knocks that seemed to answer questions with eerie precision. A single rap for no, 3 for yes. Soon, their bedroom became a seance hotspot, with neighbors flocking to witness the ghosts communicating through the girls. Word spread like wildfire, and before long, the sisters were touring the country as celebrity mediums, charging top dollar for private sessions. What began as a game spiraled into a full-blown industry, with imitators everywhere mimicking their tricks, table tilting, floating trumpets, even phantom hands materializing in darkened rooms. But the real genius of their con wasn't the mechanics, it was the timing. America in the mid-19th century was drowning in grief. The Civil War left countless families shattered, and diseases like cholera stole lives without warning. Spiritualism offered solace, a promise that death wasn't the end. The Fox sisters didn't just exploit sadness, they weaponized hope, giving people something to cling to in an era before modern medicine or psychology could ease their pain. Churches condemned them as frauds, scientists debunked their methods, yet the crowds kept coming because what they sold wasn't just a show, it was catharsis. Decades later, long after they'd grown wealthy and famous, the sisters' guilt finally caught up with them. In 1888, Maggie stunned the world by publicly confessing in front of a packed New York auditorium, demonstrating how she'd faked the raps all those years. The crowd turned on her instantly, booing and shouting accusations. Some refused to believe the admission, clinging to the fantasy she'd helped create. The movement didn't die with their confession, it limped on for years, proving that once a lie takes root, it's harder to kill than any ghost. The Fox sisters' legacy is a haunting paradox. They were con artists, yes, but also unwitting pioneers of a phenomenon that blurred the line between fraud and faith. Their story forces us to ask, when does a lie become a religion? And why do we fight so hard to believe, even when the truth is staring us in the face? They didn't just fool a generation. They exposed the raw human need for magic in a world that often feels too cruel to bear. Ray Santilli didn't just fake a video, he staged an entire cosmic conspiracy, serving up sheep brains and raspberry jam as the smoking gun for extraterrestrial life. In 1995, the British music producer unleashed his so-called alien autopsy footage on the world, a grainy, black and white clip claiming to show US military officials dissecting a creature from the infamous Roswell crash. The film was crude, bizarre, and riddled with questionable details like the alien's oddly human-like belly button, yet it ignited a global frenzy, airing on major networks and sparking debates among scientists and UFO believers alike. Santilli's brilliance wasn't in special effects, it was in psychology. He understood that people weren't just watching his film, they were projecting their own fantasies onto it. The footage tapped into decades of Roswell mythology, Cold War secrecy, and a primal human curiosity about what or who might be out there. The alien, with its oversized head and spindly limbs, matched every pop culture stereotype, making it feel eerily familiar. And Santilli played the role of reluctant whistleblower perfectly, claiming he'd obtained the film from a mysterious retired military cameraman who'd supposedly risked his life to leak it. The story had just enough plausible deniability to hook skeptics and true believers alike. But the real magic, the sheer DIY absurdity of the hoax, Years later, Santilli admitted that Alien was a sculpted puppet stuffed with sheep brains, chicken entrails, and raspberry jam for gore. The supposed top-secret military base, a London apartment with actors in lab coats, yet even after the confession, some refused to let go. Conspiracy theorists argued the admitted hoax was just a cover for the real autopsy film, proving Santilli's greatest trick. He didn't just sell a lie, he created a myth so sticky it outlasted the truth. What makes Santilli's scam unforgettable isn't the shoddy props or the eventual reveal, it's the lesson in collective yearning. Humans don't just believe in aliens, we need to believe in them. The idea that we're not alone, that governments hide cosmic truths, that reality might be stranger than fiction, these aren't just claims. They're modern-day folklore, and Santilli didn't invent the hunger for them. He just set the table with jelly and guts, and the world eagerly pulled up a chair. Christian Gerhardsreiter didn't just borrow a famous name. He rewrote his entire life to become someone else, layer by layer, lie by lie. A German immigrant who arrived in the US with little more than ambition, he transformed himself into Clark Rockefeller, a supposed heir to the legendary Rockefeller dynasty, and maintained the charade for 3 decades. His act wasn't just about wealth, it was about crafting an aura of old money mystique so convincing that high society welcomed him with open arms, and the most astonishing part, he pulled it off without a shred of evidence, relying entirely on sheer nerve and a talent for making people believe what they wanted to see. The deception began small. In the early 1980s, fresh off the plane from Germany, Gerhardsreiter started adopting aliases, first as a British aristocrat, then a film producer, even a ship captain. But the Rockefeller persona was his masterpiece. He perfected an accent that sounded both aristocratic and vaguely international, dressed in preppy suits with perfectly knotted ties, and dropped names like they were casual acquaintances. He frequented elite art galleries and charity events, always hinting at family connections too powerful to name directly. People didn't question gaps in his stories because, well, who would dare impersonate a Rockefeller? His boldest move was marrying a successful businesswoman, Sandra Boss, who believed his tale of trust funds and secretive family obligations. They had a daughter together, and for years, Gerhardsreiter played the role of eccentric blue blood, hosting dinner parties where he'd casually mention Uncle David, referring to billionaire David Rockefeller, or dodging questions about his past with a dismissive wave. He even convinced his wife to buy them a mansion in Connecticut, all while secretly controlling her finances. The cracks only showed when their marriage crumbled, and Sandra, finally suspicious, hired a private investigator. The truth was staggering: no trust funds, no elite schooling, just a working-class kid from Bavaria who'd spun gold from thin air. But Gerhardsreiter's story took an even darker turn. After his divorce, he kidnapped his own daughter during a custody visit, triggering a nationwide manhunt. When police finally caught him, they uncovered more than just identity fraud. They linked him to the decades-old disappearance of a California couple who'd once rented him a guest house. Suddenly, the charming imposter stood accused of murder, though he'd only be convicted of the kidnapping. The trial revealed a man who didn't just want to be someone else, he needed to erase himself entirely. What makes Gerhardsreiter's case so unsettling isn't the length of the con, but its intimacy. He didn't just fool strangers, he built a life, a family, on pure fiction. And he exposed an uncomfortable truth: sometimes the right name, the right accent, the right blazer can open doors that should have been locked. The Rockefeller aura was his magic trick, a reminder that in a world obsessed with status, the best currency isn't always money. It's the story you sell, and whether anyone's brave enough to call it a lie. Uri Geller didn't just bend spoons, he bent reality itself, convincing millions he possessed supernatural powers while pocketing fortunes from governments, celebrities, and desperate believers. The self-proclaimed psychic superstar rose to fame in the 1970s with his signature trick, staring intently at a spoon until it seemingly melted in his hands. But his greatest talent wasn't telekinesis, it was showmanship, turning parlor tricks into a global phenomenon that even fooled intelligence agencies and corporate giants. Jeller's act was a masterclass in misdirection. On stage, he'd ask audiences to focus their mental energy as he gently stroked a spoon, which would then appear to warp or snap without physical force. The secret, simple sleight of hand, pre-bent spoons, hidden pressure, and the power of suggestion. Yet his delivery was so convincing that people swore they felt their own watches stop or keys bend in their pockets just by watching him. His performances weren't just shows, they were mass hypnosis sessions, blurring the line between illusion and delusion. The real twist, Jeller's scams went far beyond stage magic. He claimed the CIA recruited him for psychic spy programs during the Cold War, using his remote viewing abilities to locate secret Soviet bases. Declassified documents later showed the agency did test him not because they believed, but because they feared the Soviets might be investing in paranormal warfare. Jeller spun this into a myth of government endorsement, landing lucrative consulting gigs with companies like Volkswagen and Shell, who paid him to use his powers to find oil or improve machinery. Even after scientists like James Randi exposed his methods on live TV, Jeller's followers refused to accept the truth, accusing critics of close-mindedness. What made Jeller unstoppable wasn't his tricks, it was his ability to weaponize doubt. In a world full of unsolved mysteries, he offered a seductive idea that some people truly could defy physics. His cons thrived in the gray area between science and faith, where the human desire to believe in the impossible overpowered logic. Decades later, his legacy lingers, a reminder that the most profitable magic trick isn't bending metal, it's bending minds. Anna Delvey didn't just fake wealth, she weaponized it, turning New York's elite into unwitting extras in her high-stakes performance as a German heiress. Armed with forged bank statements, a thick accent she'd perfected, and an unshakable sense of entitlement, she conned her way into the city's most exclusive circles, leaving behind a trail of unpaid six-figure hotel bills, maxed-out credit cards, and even a failed bid to launch her own private arts club. But her most audacious trick, making people believe that not paying for things was proof of her blue-blooded status. The act began in 2014 when Delvey's real name, Anna Sorokin, arrived in New York after a brief stint interning at a Paris fashion magazine. She reinvented herself overnight, adopting the persona of a trust fund princess with a mysterious, jet-setting father funding her lavish lifestyle. She booked suites at the Mercer Hotel and 11 Howard, dropped thousands on designer clothes, and tipped staff with $100 bills, all while dodging actual payments with promises of wire transfers from offshore accounts. Her genius lay in understanding that in Manhattan's social scene, perception was currency. If you acted like you belonged, no one dared to ask for proof. Delvey's scams weren't just about free vacations, though. She spun elaborate fantasies about founding the Anna Delvey Foundation, a members-only arts club she claimed would rival Soho House. She charmed venture capitalists, lawyers, and even a former Vanity Fair photo editor into investing time, connections, and cash into her vision. At one point, she convinced a private jet company to fly her and friends to Omaha for a Warren Buffett conference, then left the bill unpaid. When questioned, she'd feign offense, implying that her family's wealth was too vast for petty concerns like invoices. The cracks started showing when banks finally noticed the fabricated financial documents she'd used to secure loans. A private Moroccan getaway with a group of influencers which she'd promised to cover ended in chaos when the resort demanded payment and Delvey's credit cards failed. Friends who'd lent her money began asking uncomfortable questions, and in 2017, her house of cards collapsed. Arrested mid-Lux brunch, she faced charges for grand larceny and theft of services totaling over $200,000. Yet even her trial became part of the spectacle. Delvey showed up in designer outfits borrowed from her stylist, treating the courtroom like a runway. Reporters dubbed her the Soho grifter, and Netflix turned her story into a hit series. What makes her con so unforgettable isn't the money she stole, it's how blatantly she exposed the loopholes in high society. She proved that with the right accent, the right wardrobe, and enough arrogance, you could convince people that owing money was just how the rich lived. In a city obsessed with status, Anna Delvey didn't just break the rules, she wrote her own, then charged everyone else for the privilege of reading them. Charles Ponzi didn't just invent a scam, he built an entire financial mythology around it, turning postal coupons into the foundation of one of history's most notorious schemes. In 1920, the Italian immigrant promised investors a 50% return in just 90 days by exploiting international reply coupons, an obscure postal system quirk meant to facilitate global mail. The idea sounded almost plausible. Buy these coupons cheaply in countries with weak currencies, exchange them for higher value stamps in the US, then pocket the difference. But Ponzi's real genius wasn't in currency arbitrage, it was in realizing no one would bother checking the math as long as the checks kept coming. The frenzy began small, with early investors receiving their payouts on time. Word spread like wildfire, and soon working-class Bostonians were lining up outside Ponzi's office, clutching life savings they hoped to multiply. Ponzi leaned into the spectacle, wearing sharp suits, flashing a gold-tipped cane, and leasing a mansion to reinforce his image as a financial wizard. At its peak, his operation was raking in millions per week, equivalent to tens of millions today, with new money frantically pouring in to pay off earlier investors. The scheme wasn't just unsustainable, it was mathematically impossible. Experts later calculated that fulfilling his promises would have required nearly 200 million international reply coupons circulating globally, but only about 30,000 actually existed. But Ponzi wasn't content with just coupon fraud. As prohibition tightened its grip, he saw another opportunity: smuggling alcohol. He leased a fleet of ships, planning to import rum from the Caribbean under the guise of legitimate trade. The venture collapsed almost immediately, with one ship seized by authorities and another mysteriously sinking. The alcohol plan exposed his reckless overreach, drawing scrutiny from journalists and regulators. Reporters at the Boston Post began digging, discovering Ponzi's past arrests for forgery and even a stint in a Canadian prison for check fraud. The house of cards trembled, then collapsed. When authorities finally shut down his operation, thousands of investors were left with nothing. Ponzi's bravado didn't waver even in court, where he quipped, "I gave them the best show that was ever staged." After serving prison time, he was deported to Italy, where he briefly worked for Mussolini's government before dying penniless in a Rio de Janeiro charity hospital. His legacy, though, outlived him. The term Ponzi scheme became shorthand for any fraud that pays old investors with new victims' money, a blueprint followed by every financial charlatan from Bernie Madoff to cryptocurrency hucksters. What makes Ponzi's story timeless isn't just the mechanics of the con, it's the psychology. He proved that greed could short-circuit skepticism, that the allure of easy money could make people ignore glaring red flags. His scheme wasn't just about profit, it was about belief, and in that sense, Charles Ponzi wasn't just a fraudster. He was a dark prophet of human nature, showing us that the most dangerous scams aren't the ones that fool your wallet, but the ones that first fool your hope. Most teenagers spend their senior year of high school juggling homework and prom plans, but Michael Sessions had loftier ambitions. At just 18 years old, he became the youngest mayor in U.S. history by winning a write-in campaign in Hillsdale, Michigan. It was a feel-good story, the kind that made national headlines, a bright, determined kid who outworked the political establishment. But behind the wholesome facade lay a shocking truth: Sessions wasn't just an overachiever. He was a con artist who'd faked his residency to qualify for office, then used his position to fund a personal spending spree on video games, fast food, and even a homecoming tuxedo. The scam started with a technicality: To run for mayor, candidates had to live within city limits for at least 30 days before filing. Sessions, still living with his parents just outside town, quietly rented a basement apartment from a family friend, on paper only. He never actually moved in, but the address was enough to satisfy election officials. Then came the real hustle, a grassroots campaign fueled by relentless door-knocking, homemade signs, and a clever play on his underdog status. Voters adored the idea of a fresh-faced kid taking on City Hall, and in 2005 he won by a mere 2 votes. Once in office, Sessions didn't just struggle with the responsibilities of local government, he exploited them. He racked up thousands on the city's dime, swiping a taxpayer-funded credit card for everything from fast food runs to gaming consoles disguised as office equipment. When questioned, he claimed the expenses were for mayoral outreach or community engagement, arguing that bonding with constituents over burgers was part of the job. The audacity was almost impressive. Here was a teenager treating public office like an allowance, convinced he could talk his way out of any scrutiny. The scheme unraveled when a local paper dug into his spending. Records showed over $4,000 in suspicious charges, including a PlayStation and late-night pizza deliveries. Even more brazen, he'd used city funds to rent a limo for his high school homecoming dance, insisting it was a networking opportunity with other young leaders. Facing public outrage and a recall effort, Sessions eventually pleaded no contest to embezzlement charges, though he avoided jail time with restitution and probation. What makes Sessions' story unforgettable isn't the dollar amount, it's the sheer gall. Most con artists fleece strangers. He fleeced the very people who'd believed in him. His downfall exposed a darker side of that feel-good narrative, ambition untethered from ethics, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the person you cheer for is playing you all along. In the end, Michael Sessions wasn't just a kid who got in over his head. He was a reminder that age doesn't dictate corruption, audacity does. John Keely didn't just invent a machine. He invented an entire scientific fantasy, one so captivating that investors poured millions into a device that defied the laws of physics itself. For 30 years, this self-proclaimed discoverer of etheric force convinced the world he'd unlocked perpetual motion, demonstrating a mysterious engine that supposedly ran on water and mysterious vibrations. The truth, his miraculous machine was powered by nothing but hidden air tubes, cleverly concealed magnets, and the sheer desperation of people who wanted to believe the impossible. Keely's rise began in the 1870s when steam power dominated industry and the world hungered for the next energy revolution. He claimed his hydro-pneumatic pulsating vacuum engine could harness the interatomic vibrations of ether, a made-up force he described with enough scientific-sounding jargon to baffle journalists and wealthy backers alike. At demonstrations, his machine would shudder to life, lifting heavy weights or playing eerie musical notes seemingly without any fuel source. But the real magic happened offstage, where Keely employed a network of hidden pipes pumping compressed air from the basement, all while lecturing audiences about sympathetic vibrations and quadruple harmonic intervals. What made Keely's con so enduring wasn't just the mechanical trickery, it was his ability to exploit the gap between science and wonder. At a time when electricity and radio waves still felt like sorcery to the public, he positioned himself as a misunderstood genius ahead of his time. He formed the Keely Motor Company, selling shares to prominent businessmen, including a director of the Pennsylvania Railroad. When skeptics demanded proof, he'd deliver hours of dense, incomprehensible lectures about etheric disintegration, leaving them too exhausted to question further. One investor even wrote, "I don't understand it, but I know it's real." The cracks started showing when an engineer noticed Keely's water-fueled machine never actually used water. Then a reporter discovered the basement air compressor, but Keely's most audacious move came next. He claimed sabotage by the scientific establishment, painting himself as a martyr to narrow-minded thinking. Supporters rallied around him, funding new experiments even as evidence of fraud mounted. It wasn't until his death in 1898 that the full truth emerged. Workshop blueprints revealed hollow floorboards feeding hidden tubes and electromagnets disguised as harmonic resonators. Keely's legacy isn't just about the money he stole. It's about the lengths people will go to believe in a better mousetrap. In an era before regulators cracked down on stock fraud, his scheme proved that the right buzzwords could turn nonsense into an investment strategy. Today, his name lives on as a cautionary tale. When someone promises to break the laws of physics, check the basement first, because the only thing truly perpetual about Keely's machine. The human hunger for miracles. Dr. Leo Spaceman didn't need a medical degree to perform surgeries, just a steak knife, a borrowed lab coat, and enough confidence to make patients believe he was the real deal. In the 1970s, this self-proclaimed surgeon set up shop in Florida, where lax regulations and desperate patients created the perfect breeding ground for his brand of medical mayhem. His operating room wasn't in a hospital, it was a rundown motel suite, and his surgical tools included kitchen utensils and a stapler he'd picked up from an office supply store. Yet for years, terrified patients lined up for his expertise, walking away with botched incisions, life-threatening infections, and bills that rivaled those of legitimate hospitals. Spaceman's scam was as reckless as it was simple. He'd lure in vulnerable patients, often undocumented immigrants or those without insurance, with promises of cut-rate procedures. Hernia repairs, gallbladder removals, even appendectomies, he'd attempt them all with no formal training. Just a dog-eared medical textbook and a chilling willingness to improvise. During one infamous operation, his scalpel broke mid-surgery, so he grabbed a steak knife from the motel's kitchen, sterilized it with vodka, and kept cutting. Patients later described waking up to bloody bandages and excruciating pain, only for Spaceman to vanish with their cash before complications set in. What made Spaceman so dangerous wasn't just his lack of skill, it was his ability to mimic the trappings of legitimacy. He wore a stethoscope like a prop, scribbled prescriptions on stolen pads, and even hired actors to pose as nurses during consultations. When questioned about his credentials, he'd flash a forged diploma from a defunct Caribbean medical school or dismiss critics as jealous competitors. The act was flimsy, but for people with no other options, the illusion of care was enough. By the time one patient nearly bled to death from a botched hysterectomy, authorities finally took notice. The investigation revealed a trail of horror: unsterilized instruments stored in takeout containers, used syringes tossed in motel dumpsters, and at least 3 deaths linked to his butchery. At trial, prosecutors played a chilling tape of Spaceman coaching a patient through her own gallstone removal over the phone, instructing her to press down hard when the pain got bad. His defense: he claimed he was a humanitarian providing underserved communities with affordable health care. The jury didn't buy it. Convicted of manslaughter and fraud, Spaceman spent his remaining years in prison, where he reportedly offered to perform cell-block dental work for a fee, of course. Spaceman's legacy isn't just about the lives he ruined, it's about the system that let him thrive. In an era before digital records and strict licensing, charlatans like him slipped through the cracks by preying on those too scared or broke to ask questions. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When healthcare becomes a luxury, even a fraud with a steak knife can pass for a savior. And in the shadows of every society, there's always someone willing to exploit that desperation, with or without a medical degree. Clifford Irving didn't just write a book, he engineered an entire literary heist, fooling publishers, journalists, and the entire world into believing he'd penned the autobiography of Howard Hughes, the notoriously reclusive billionaire. The audacity of the scheme was staggering. Irving claimed he'd spent months secretly interviewing Hughes, even producing handwritten letters from the aviation tycoon to prove their collaboration. The letters, of course, were forged, meticulously crafted by Irving himself, who'd studied Hughes' handwriting like an art student copying a master. For a brief, dazzling moment, the literary world bought it hook, line, and sinker, handing Irving a massive advance for what should have been the publishing coup of the century. The plan was born out of pure opportunism. In the early 1970s, Hughes hadn't been seen in public for over a decade, living like a ghost in penthouse suites and private islands. His silence made him the perfect target. Irving, a mid-tier novelist with a knack for mimicry, realized no one could disprove his claims if Hughes himself never spoke up. So he drafted a sample chapter, forged a contract bearing Hughes' signature, and pitched the book to McGraw-Hill with a straight face. The publisher, blinded by the potential of a Hughes tell-all, didn't just bite, they offered a jaw-dropping $750,000 advance, equivalent to millions today. But Irving's brilliance and eventual downfall lay in the details. He didn't just fake letters, he built an entire backstory, claiming Hughes insisted on secrecy so extreme that all communication had to be handwritten and passed through a mysterious third party. Irving even staged clandestine meetings with his own wife, pretending she was Hughes' intermediary, while journalists trailed them, desperate for a scoop. The closer scrutiny got, the more layers Irving added, including a forged Swiss bank account where Hughes' share of the advance would supposedly be deposited. It was a house of cards, but for months it held. Then the unthinkable happened. Howard Hughes broke his silence. In a teleconference with 7 journalists, his first public statement in 15 years, the billionaire denounced Irving as a fraud, calling the autobiography a total fabrication. The press scrambled. Irving, cornered, doubled down, claiming the man on the call was an imposter. But the jig was up. Handwriting experts confirmed the letters were forgeries, and Irving's wife, terrified of perjury charges, confessed to her role in the charade. The would-be literary giant was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, his legacy forever tied to one of publishing's most brazen deceptions. What makes Irving's story unforgettable isn't just the scale of the lie, it's the sheer theatricality of it. He didn't just deceive, he staged an elaborate production, casting himself as the brilliant biographer and Hughes as his unwilling co-star. And in doing so, he exposed an uncomfortable truth. When a story is juicy enough, even the smartest people will suspend disbelief. The world didn't just want Hughes' autobiography, they needed it, and Clifford Irving was happy to sell it to them, one forged page at a time. Frederick Burden didn't just steal an identity, he rewrote an entire life, slipping into the skin of a missing Texas boy with such conviction that even the child's family embraced him as their own. In 1997, this French con artist arrived in Spain claiming to be Nicolas Barclay, a 13-year-old who'd vanished from San Antonio 3 years earlier. The details were absurd on paper. Burden was 23 with brown eyes and a heavy accent, while Nicholas had been blonde and blue-eyed. Yet with a concoction of trauma-induced memory loss, forged documents, and psychological manipulation, Burden pulled off one of history's most chilling impersonations, exposing just how far longing can warp reality. The ruse began with a single phone call to a missing children's center in Spain, where Burden, posing as Nicholas, spun a tale of kidnapping and abuse at the hands of a shadowy military cult. His performance was masterful, voice trembling, details fragmented, just credible enough to trigger a whirlwind of media attention and official urgency. When Nicholas's older sister flew to Spain to identify him, Burden compensated for their stark physical differences with sheer theatrics, dyeing his hair, wearing colored contacts, and shrinking into the demeanor of a traumatized child. He recited intimate family details gleaned from news reports, crying as he remembered his mother's perfume and his brother's nickname. The sister, overwhelmed by hope, declared him genuine on the spot. But Burden's true genius lay in weaponizing empathy. He understood that grief could blind even the most skeptical observers. Authorities overlooked glaring red flags: his stubble-covered face, his inability to recall basic English phrases because the idea of a lost boy coming home was too powerful to question. Social workers dismissed his accent as a side effect of trauma, while psychologists diagnosed him with dissociative amnesia. For 5 months, Burden lived as Nicholas, enrolling in school, attending therapy, and even being interviewed by Oprah Winfrey's producers. The charade only collapsed when a sharp-eyed FBI agent noticed his fingerprints matched those of a known European imposter with a history of posing as orphans. What makes Burden's deception unforgettable isn't just the audacity, it's the aftermath. After his arrest, Nicholas's family, once overjoyed, spiraled into deeper turmoil, their wounds ripped open anew. Burden, ever the opportunist, later claimed he'd sought refuge in the Barclays home to escape his own abusive past. But the truth was simpler. He thrived on the chaos of becoming someone else, no matter the cost. His story forces us to ask, is identity just a story we tell or a story others choose to believe? And in the right hands, can a lie become so convincing that even the truth bows to it? P.T. Barnum didn't just run a circus, he ran a factory of wonder, churning out hoaxes so elaborate that people happily paid to be fooled. Long before he became synonymous with the greatest show on earth, Barnum mastered the art of the spectacle, blurring the line between entertainment and outright fraud. His first big hit, a woman named Joyce Heth, a blind, elderly black woman he billed as the 161-year-old former nurse of George Washington. Barnum paraded her across the country, spinning tales of her feeding the infant founding father and even singing hymns she'd supposedly taught him. The crowds ate it up until an autopsy revealed she was likely 80 at most, her age exaggerated by decades for the sake of a good story. But Barnum didn't flinch. He simply shrugged and moved on to his next act, proving that in his world, the truth was whatever sold tickets. Then came the Fiji mermaid, perhaps his most infamous creation. This grotesque fusion of a monkey's torso and a fish's tail, stitched together with meticulous care, was marketed as a genuine specimen from the South Pacific. Barnum didn't just display it, he orchestrated an entire publicity campaign, planting fake articles in newspapers to build hype before the mermaid even went on view. He even hired a naturalist to swear it was real, knowing full well it was a Frankenstein's monster of taxidermy. The public flocked to see it, not because they believed, but because they wanted to. That was Barnum's real genius. He understood that people didn't come for facts. They came for the thrill of the impossible, for the chance to debate whether something so absurd could maybe, just maybe, be true. What set Barnum apart wasn't just the hoaxes themselves, it was his shameless embrace of the backlash. When skeptics called him out, he'd lean into the controversy, stoking arguments to keep his exhibits in the headlines. There's no such thing as bad publicity, he famously quipped, and he proved it by turning every exposé into another reason for crowds to line up. Even after the Fiji mermaid was exposed as a fake, he kept it on tour, winking at the audience's willingness to play along. In a way, Barnum wasn't conning people, he was collaborating with them. The real show wasn't the mermaid or the ancient nurse, it was the collective suspension of disbelief, the shared joy of being in on the joke, even when you were the punchline. His legacy is a paradox, a man who built an empire on lies but somehow gave the world something real, the pure, uncomplicated delight of being entertained. Because in the end, P.T. Barnum didn't just sell tickets, he sold magic, and sometimes that's the most valuable con of all. Anthony Gignac didn't just pretend to be rich, he transformed into royalty, crafting an alter ego so convincing that luxury hotels and elite social circles bowed to him for decades. Born in Colombia and adopted by a Michigan family, Gignac reinvented himself as Khalid bin al-Saud, a fictional Saudi prince with bottomless wealth and a taste for the finer things. His act wasn't just about flashy Rolexes and rented Lamborghinis. It was a meticulously staged production, complete with fake diplomatic papers, a phantom entourage, and the kind of arrogance that made doubters second-guess themselves. For 20 years, he jet-setted across the globe, leaving behind a trail of bounced checks, furious hotel managers, and one burning question. How did a kid from Grand Rapids fool the world into thinking he was Middle Eastern royalty? The scam hinged on two things: audacity and atmosphere. Gignac didn't just book a suite, he demanded the presidential one, flanked by bodyguards, usually friends he'd paid in cash or promises. He'd arrive at five-star hotels like the Ritz-Carlton or the Four Seasons with suitcases stuffed with newspaper bundles wrapped in $100 bills. Just enough real cash to flash a check-in before switching to fraudulent checks or stolen credit cards for the actual payments. Staff were too dazzled or intimidated to question the prince's whims, whether it was ordering $1,000 bottles of champagne for the lobby or testing luxury cars from dealerships he never returned. In Miami, he convinced a jeweler to lend him a $250,000 watch for approval from his royal family. Spoiler, the family never saw it. But Gignac's most brazen trick was leveraging the unspoken rules of high society. Wealthy elites rarely ask for proof. They assume anyone with the right accent, the right clothes, and the right arrogance belongs. So when Prince Khaled charmed his way into private parties or investor meetings, no one dared request his credentials. He even fooled a U.S. congressman into arranging a White House tour, though Secret Service agents grew suspicious when his diplomatic passport turned out to be a poorly edited template from the internet. The cracks finally showed in 2017, when Beverly Hills police arrested him after he tried swindling the Waldorf Astoria out of $30,000 in unpaid stays. A search of his laptop revealed folders labeled Prince Stuff, filled with forged documents and photoshopped images of him with celebrities, a digital paper trail of his own myth-making. What makes Gignac's story unforgettable isn't the luxury he stole, it's the cultural blind spots he exposed. In an era obsessed with status symbols, he proved that perception is more valuable than reality. A fake crown, a confident smirk, and a willingness to treat the world like your personal ATM could open doors that should have been locked. And in the end, his greatest con wasn't impersonating a prince, it was revealing how badly people wanted to believe in fairy tales, even when the royalty was just a guy from Michigan with a talent for theatrics. Frank Abagnale didn't just forge checks, he forged entire identities, becoming a teenage chameleon who outsmarted airlines, banks, and the FBI with nothing but a razor-sharp wit and a knack for spotting loopholes. Long before Leonardo DiCaprio played him in Catch Me If You Can, Abagnale was living the role in real life, spinning a web of cons so audacious they blurred the line between genius and insanity. His most infamous stunt, posing as a Pan Am pilot at just 16 years old, logging over 2 million miles of free flights while the airline unknowingly footed the bill. The scheme started with a single observation: pilots were treated like royalty. So Abagnale studied their mannerisms, memorized flight manuals, and even befriended actual crew members to learn the lingo. Then, with a forged ID and a uniform pieced together from second-hand stores, he strolled into Pan Am's personnel office claiming he'd lost his badge. The staff didn't just hand him a replacement, they gave him a crew schedule, putting him on flights to Paris, Tokyo, and Miami. For 2 years, he worked as a co-pilot, charming flight attendants, signing autographs for passengers, and cashing fake paychecks he'd printed himself. The brilliance of the con wasn't just the impersonation, it was the psychological safety net he built. Who would suspect a baby-faced kid in a crisp uniform? But Abagnale wasn't content with just free travel. He exploited every loophole he could find, from printing counterfeit checks on Pan Am's own stock to posing as a Harvard law student and even a supervising professor for an 8-month stint in Louisiana. His chutzpah reached its peak when he bluffed his way into a job as a hospital administrator, nearly performing surgeries before nerves got the better of him. The FBI later estimated he'd cashed over $2.5 million in bad checks, all before his 21st birthday. What makes a Bagnell story so mesmerizing isn't just the crimes, it's the sheer vulnerability of the systems he exposed. Airlines didn't verify credentials because they assumed no one would dare impersonate a pilot. Banks accepted handwritten checks because they trusted the appearance of legitimacy. And society, dazzled by uniforms and confidence, rarely stopped to ask for proof. A Bagnell wasn't a master hacker or a tech wizard. He was a people hacker, exploiting the one flaw no software could patch: human gullibility. After finally being caught in France and serving time in multiple countries, a Bagnell did the unthinkable. He turned his life around, working with the FBI for over 4 decades to teach them the tricks of the fraud trade. Today, his legacy is a paradox: the ultimate con artist who became the ultimate crime fighter, proving that sometimes the best way to catch a liar is to think like one. His story forces us to ask, was Frank a Bagnell a criminal genius, or just a mirror held up to a world that desperately wanted to believe in the costumes people wear? Either way, he proved one thing: confidence isn't just currency. In the right hands, it's a skeleton key. Margaret Seltzer didn't just write a memoir, she staged an entire life, crafting a persona so gritty and raw that Oprah Winfrey herself championed her book as a testament to survival. In 2008, Seltzer released Love and Consequences, a harrowing account of her supposed childhood as a half-white, half-Native American girl growing up in South Central Los Angeles, running drugs for the Bloods and losing loved ones to gang violence. The book was hailed as a blisteringly authentic voice from the streets, a rare glimpse into a world of poverty and resilience. There was just one problem: none of it was true. Seltzer wasn't a gangland survivor. She was a privileged girl from Sherman Oaks who'd attended private school and never set foot in South Central. But her deception didn't stop at the page. She hired actors to pose as her family during publicity tours, turning her fictional trauma into a full-blown performance. The ruse began with a carefully constructed backstory. Seltzer, writing under the pseudonym Margaret B. Jones, spun tales of foster care, gang initiations, and drug deals gone wrong. Stories she claimed were drawn from her own experiences. Publishers bit hard, dazzled by her authenticity. She even peppered the manuscript with slang and dialect to bolster the illusion, insisting she'd written it all in notebooks while riding buses across L.A. Critics praised the book's unflinching honesty, and Oprah's team invited her for an interview, ready to anoint her as the next voice of marginalized America. But the house of cards collapsed when Seltzer's real sister, stunned to see her siblings' fabricated life splashed across the media, contacted the publisher with proof of the lie. What made Seltzer's scam so galling wasn't just the plagiarism of pain, it was the sheer production value. She didn't just lie in print, she weaponized empathy, staging photo shoots with hired relatives in borrowed urban wear and coaching them to echo her fabricated memories in interviews. At book signings, she'd break down in tears recounting events that never happened, while audiences clutched their copies, moved by her bravery. It was a con that preyed on society's hunger for gritty, real stories. The kind that let readers pat themselves on the back for confronting hard truths, even when those truths were pure fiction. When the truth surfaced, the fallout was brutal. Oprah's team canceled the interview, the publisher recalled every copy, and Seltzer's career evaporated overnight. But the deeper scandal wasn't her betrayal of readers. It was her theft of a narrative that wasn't hers to take. In an era obsessed with trauma porn and authentic voices, she'd exposed an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most marketable stories aren't the ones that are real, but the ones that feel real enough to sell. Seltzer didn't just fake a memoir, she turned suffering into a costume, and for a brief, shining moment, the world couldn't look away. Tania Head didn't just lie about surviving the World Trade Center attacks. She turned herself into the poster child for resilience, weaving a story so heartbreaking that even the most hardened New Yorkers embraced her as a symbol of hope. For years, she was the face of the World Trade Center Survivors Network, giving emotional speeches, leading tours at Ground Zero, and recounting harrowing details of crawling through smoke and debris after the South Tower was hit. She spoke of losing her fiancé, Dave, in the North Tower, and even showed burns on her arm as proof of her ordeal. There was just one problem: Tanya Head wasn't in New York on September 11th. She wasn't even in the country. The depth of her deception was staggering. Head, whose real name was Alicia Esteve Head, was actually attending business school in Spain when the attacks happened. But by 2003, she'd inserted herself into the survivor community with a tale so vivid it defied disbelief. She claimed she'd been on the 78th floor of the South Tower when the plane hit, rescued by a heroic man named Wells Crowther, a real victim whose family later confirmed they'd never met her. She described holding Dave's hand as he died, though no record of a victim matching his name existed. She even fooled doctors into treating her for PTSD, and her performances were so convincing that she became a media darling, featured in documentaries and invited to speak at memorial events. What made Head's con so chilling wasn't just the lies, it was the emotional theft. She hijacked the grief of a city still raw with loss, positioning herself as both a victim and a healer. At survivor meetings, she'd break down in tears while recounting her escape, offering comfort to others who'd actually lived through the horror. She leveraged their trauma to build a persona of saintly strength, even lobbying for better survivor benefits she'd later collect. The act held up for nearly 4 years until a New York Times reporter noticed inconsistencies in her story. A quick records check revealed she hadn't worked at Merrill Lynch as she claimed, and her name was absent from all survivor logs. When the truth came out, the fallout was brutal. The survivor community felt violated, their trust twisted into a stage for her performance. But the real question wasn't just how she'd fooled everyone, it was why. Psychologists later speculated that Head craved the kind of attention and purpose trauma survivors often receive, a perverse shortcut to significance. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In the aftermath of tragedy, the line between compassion and exploitation can vanish, and for those desperate enough, even the darkest chapters of history can be rewritten, not with ink but with tears. Eusapia Palladino didn't just hold seances, she staged full-blown supernatural spectacles, complete with floating tables, ghostly hands, and disembodied voices that left even hardened scientists questioning reality. This Italian mystic rocketed to fame in the late 19th century as one of Europe's most sought-after mediums, claiming to channel spirits who could bend spoons, levitate furniture, and strum phantom harps. But her real talent wasn't communicating with the dead. It was exploiting the living, using hidden wires, secret accomplices, and a flair for drama that turned skepticism into sheer wonder. What set Palladino apart wasn't just the audacity of her tricks. It was her ability to fool some of the brightest minds of the era, including Nobel Prize-winning physicists who walked away convinced they'd witnessed genuine paranormal phenomena. Her performances were masterclasses in controlled chaos. Palladino would insist on sitting in near darkness, draped in heavy curtains to contain the spiritual energy. Attendees were instructed to hold hands in a circle, their fingers interlaced to prevent interference with the delicate forces at work. Then the show would begin, tables tilting violently, unseen hands plucking at sleeves, cold breezes wafting through the room. The key to her success was distraction while the audience fixated on a floating trumpet. Palladino's hidden accomplice might be tugging wires beneath the table or using their feet to lift it from below. One favorite trick involved a hidden armature strapped to her body, allowing her to extend a false limb that could materialize across the room while her real hands remained visibly restrained. Scientists who tested her didn't stand a chance. Palladino played on their biases, knowing they'd focus on ruling out one type of fraud while missing another. When researchers tied her down with ropes, she'd secretly slacken the knots with gradual movements. If they demanded hand inspections, she'd use her teeth or knees to manipulate objects just out of view. The infamous Palladino tilt, a technique where she'd shift her weight imperceptibly to make tables rock, became a staple of her act, mimicking supernatural force with pure physics. Even when caught red-handed, she'd spin the exposure as proof of spirits, borrowing her body, turning accusations into part of the mystique. The fallout was as revealing as the fraud itself. After years of debate, a thorough investigation in 1910 caught Palladino using a foot to lift a table and a hidden strand of hair to ring a bell. Yet her legacy endured, not because the tricks were flawless, but because people wanted to believe. Palladino exposed a universal truth: the line between science and superstition isn't always drawn by evidence. Sometimes it's drawn by hope, the hope that death isn't the end, that loved ones might still speak, that magic isn't just an illusion. And in that space between doubt and desire, charlatans like Palladino don't just survive. They thrive. Gregor MacGregor didn't just sell swampland, he sold an entire country, complete with lush cities, fertile soil, and a government that existed only in his imagination. In the 1820s, this Scottish general turned London high society into his personal mark, peddling deeds to the fictional paradise of Poyais, a Central American utopia he claimed to rule as its benevolent sovereign. The audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. MacGregor didn't just forge maps and currency. He drafted a constitution, designed a coat of arms, and even published a guidebook extolling Poyais' golden beaches and thriving economy. Investors and settlers alike fell for the fantasy, pouring their life savings into a nation as real as a mirage. MacGregor's genius lay in his attention to detail. He'd served briefly in South American revolutionary armies, giving him just enough credibility to spin tales of a land ripe for colonization. His Poyais prospectus boasted of diamond mines, teak forests, and a capital city called St. Joseph, where streets were paved with opportunity. To seal the deal, he hosted lavish receptions at London hotels, introducing starry-eyed Brits to his Poyasian delegation, actors dressed in exotic uniforms who spoke in broken English about the wonders awaiting them. When skeptics asked why no one had heard of Poyais, MacGregor blamed Spanish colonial cartographers for erasing it from maps. The lie was ridiculous, but in an era when distant lands were still shrouded in mystery, it was just plausible enough to work. The first wave of settlers sailed in 1823, armed with MacGregor's deeds and dreams of a fresh start. What they found was a mosquito-infested stretch of Honduran coastline with no infrastructure, no government, and no trace of the paradise they'd been promised. Malaria and starvation set in quickly. Survivors were eventually rescued by passing ships, but not before half had perished. Back in London, MacGregor was already spinning the tragedy as a temporary setback, blaming incompetent guides and even planning a second expedition. It wasn't until newspapers published survivor accounts that the scam unraveled. Yet even then, MacGregor escaped serious consequences. He fled to France, where he promptly tried the same scheme again, this time selling Poyasian bonds to Parisian bankers. Arrested but never convicted, he eventually slunk back to South America, where he somehow talked the Venezuelan government into granting him a pension for his revolutionary services. His legacy isn't just a tale of greed, it's a masterclass in how easily hope can be weaponized. MacGregor didn't just exploit money, he exploited the human desire for a better world. And in that sense, Poyais wasn't entirely fictional. It was a mirror reflecting every dreamer's weakness, the belief that somewhere, just beyond the horizon, lies a place where all our struggles vanish, if only someone would sell us the map. John R. Brinkley didn't just peddle fake medicine, he turned goat testicles into a multi-million-dollar empire, convincing desperate men they could regain their youth, virility, and health with a single grotesque surgery. In the early 1920s, this self-proclaimed doctor claimed he discovered the ultimate cure for impotence and aging, transplanting goat gonads into human patients. The procedure was as absurd as it was dangerous, yet Brinkley's slick salesmanship and mastery of early radio marketing turned him into one of America's most infamous quacks, leaving a trail of ruined lives and corpses in his wake. Brinkley's rise began in rural Kansas, where he set up a clinic promising miracles to men embarrassed by their fading vitality. His supposed breakthrough came from observing the vigor of goats, leading him to theorize that their glands could rejuvenate human patients. With no medical degree, he'd bought his diploma from a sham college in Missouri. He began slicing open men's scrotums, inserting slivers of goat testicles, and stitching them back up with theatrical flair. Never mind that the human immune system would inevitably reject the foreign tissue, causing horrific infections. Brinkley's patients were so eager to believe, they ignored the pus, the gangrene, and the occasional death on the operating table. What made Brinkley unstoppable wasn't his surgical skills, it was his marketing genius. He pioneered the use of radio as a propaganda tool, buying airtime to broadcast his own show, The Medical Question Box, where he diagnosed listeners' ailments and prescribed his treatments on air. His voice oozed folksy charm as he spun pseudoscientific jargon about glandular rejuvenation and endocrine harmony. To skeptical doctors, he scoffed, "The medical profession is always 20 years behind the times." And the public ate it up. At his peak, he was performing over 50 goat gland surgeries a day, charging the equivalent of $20,000 per procedure in today's money. But Brinkley's real innovation was in exploiting legal loopholes. When Kansas finally revoked his medical license, he simply moved his operation to Mexico, building a radio tower so powerful it blasted his ads across the American heartland. He even ran for governor of Kansas as a write-in candidate, promising free radios for every household conveniently tuned to his station. The scheme nearly worked too, until election officials misplaced thousands of his votes. By then, his legacy was already written. Dozens dead from botched surgeries, countless others maimed, and a fortune built on the oldest con of all, the fear of mortality. His downfall came when the American Medical Association and the Federal Radio Commission finally dismantled his empire, but not before he'd inspired a generation of hucksters. Brinkley's story isn't just about medical fraud, it's about the seductive power of hope and how easily it can be twisted into exploitation. He didn't just sell goat testicles. He sold the dream of cheating time itself, proving that when people are desperate enough, they'll believe anything, even if it costs them everything. George Somonazar didn't just invent a backstory. He crafted an entire civilization from thin air, convincing 18th century Europe he was a prince from the distant island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan. With pale skin, blonde hair, and no trace of Asian ancestry, this French-born impostor defied logic by passing himself off as an exotic foreigner, spinning tales of human sacrifice, tree worship, and a language he'd fabricated syllable by syllable. His audacity wasn't just in the lie, it was in the sheer detail. He didn't just claim to be Formosan, he wrote a best-selling book about it, complete with maps, alphabets, and rituals so vivid that scholars debated them for decades. The ruse began in 1703 when Somonazar, a name he likely borrowed from a biblical figure, appeared in Germany claiming to be a pagan convert on the run from Jesuit missionaries. His act was flawless. He spoke in a self-invented Formosan tongue, worshipped a brass idol he carried in his pocket, and claimed to eat raw meat to honor his homeland's customs. When pressed, he'd switch to broken Latin or Dutch, insisting these were languages he'd learned as a captive. By the time he reached England, his reputation preceded him. Anglican clergy, eager to spite Catholic rivals, embraced him as a trophy convert, parading him through salons and lecture halls as proof of their global reach. But Somonazar's real masterpiece was an historical and geographical description of Formosa, published in 1704. The book was a work of pure fiction, yet it read like an anthropological study. He described Formosa as a land of golden-roofed temples where yearly sacrifices of 18,000 boys appeased bloodthirsty gods. He illustrated the island's alphabet, a series of jagged symbols he claimed to have designed himself, and even provided translations of the Lord's Prayer and 10 Commandments into his imaginary language. The most bizarre detail, his insistence that Formosan slept upright in chairs to avoid earthquakes, a habit he mimicked in public to sell the charade. What made Somanazar's con so enduring wasn't just creativity, it was timing. Europe was obsessed with the exotic, and first-hand accounts of distant lands were rare enough that few could fact-check him. When critics pointed out his fair complexion, he claimed Formosan nobility were pale from living underground. When asked why no explorers had mentioned his customs, he accused Jesuits of suppressing the truth. His lies thrived in the gap between curiosity and ignorance, a space where a confident storyteller could become the world's leading expert on a place that didn't exist, at least not as he described it. The unraveling came slowly. Missionaries returning from Asia found inconsistencies in his tales, and scholars began questioning his language, which bore no resemblance to real Formosan dialects. Yet, even after confessing his fraud in later memoirs, Somanazar's myths lingered. Maps circulated with his fictional geography, and his book remained in libraries as a curiosity. His legacy wasn't just as a liar, but as a mirror to an era when the line between exploration and exploitation was paper-thin. He didn't just fool people, he showed how easily the hunger for the unknown could turn fiction into fact, and how a well-told story could outlast the truth that buried it. Mark Landys didn't forge paintings to get rich, he did it to feel loved. For over 30 years, this soft-spoken con artist donated hundreds of masterpieces to museums across America, passing off his near-perfect replicas as long-lost works by Picasso, Signac, and even Walt Disney. But unlike most art forgers, Landys never took a dime. His currency wasn't cash, it was the validation that came with curators gasping over his discoveries, the thrill of being welcomed into hallowed galleries as a generous patron rather than a lonely, anonymous man. His method was deceptively simple. Landys would comb art books for obscure works by famous artists, then painstakingly recreate them using inexpensive materials from craft stores. He aged the paper with coffee stains or tea, dabbed on flecks of historic dust, and framed them in thrift store finds. Then, armed with a plausible backstory, often posing as a grieving heir or a Jesuit priest, he'd present his fakes as family heirlooms or church donations. Museums, eager to beef up their collections, rarely questioned the soft-spoken donor who asked for nothing in return. The Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, even the prestigious University of California, all fell for his charms, accepting his gifts with gratitude and display cases. What made Landys unique wasn't just his skill, it was his motive. While other forgers chased fortune or fame, he craved connection. Diagnosed with schizophrenia and living off a small inheritance, he found solace in the brief moments of respect his donations earned him. Curators would wine and dine him, press releases would trumpet his generosity, and for a little while he wasn't just Mark Landys, he was a savior of art history. The ruse wasn't flawless. Some institutions grew suspicious when they noticed his donations peeling at the edges or recognized the original still hanging in other museums. But Landys always vanished before confrontations, slipping away to target another unsuspecting gallery. The game finally ended in 2008, when a curator at the Paul and Lulu Hilliard University Art Museum noticed striking similarities between Landys's discovery and a known painting. Research revealed his trail of donated forgeries, and the art world recoiled not just from the deception, but from the uncomfortable truth it exposed. Landys hadn't hacked the system, he'd exploited its hunger for prestige and its reluctance to scrutinize a philanthropist. His story forces us to ask, is a con artist who steals admiration any less guilty than one who steals money? And in a world that worships authenticity, why are we so quick to believe the lie when it comes wrapped in generosity? Landis's legacy isn't measured in dollars or jail time. He was never prosecuted since he technically broke no laws. It's measured in the quiet irony of his final act. After his exposure, some museums began exhibiting his forgeries as a testament to his peculiar genius. The man who spent decades pretending to be part of art history finally earned his place in it, not as a donor but as the subject, a mirror held up to the institutions that so desperately wanted to believe in him. George Parker didn't just sell bridges, he sold landmarks like they were weekend garage sale finds, turning New York City's most iconic structures into his personal inventory of scams. In the late 19th century, this audacious grifter made a career out of selling properties he had no right to claim, from Grand Central Terminal to the very ground beneath Manhattan. But his masterpiece of fraud, convincing multiple suckers they could own the Brooklyn Bridge not once but twice, and even attempting to lease the Statue of Liberty to the highest bidder. Parker's brilliance wasn't in his paperwork or his legal argument, it was in his understanding of human greed and the unshakable belief that if something sounds too good to be true, there's always someone desperate enough to buy it anyway. The Brooklyn Bridge scheme was Parker's signature move. Dressed in a fine suit and oozing bureaucratic confidence, he'd approach gullible immigrants or ambitious businessmen with an irresistible pitch. The city was privately auctioning the bridge to cover maintenance costs, and for a few $100s, they could become the proud owner of a world-famous landmark. He'd produce forged documents stamped with official-looking seals, even taking marks on inspections where he'd point out repair needs as justification for the sale. The genius of the con was in its simplicity. Parker knew no one would actually try to erect a toll booth or charge admission, so the fraud could go undetected for months. Some victims only realized they'd been duped when they showed up with construction crews to renovate their new property and were promptly arrested for trespassing. But Parker didn't stop at bridges. When newspapers mocked his earlier cons, he leaned into the notoriety, upping the ante with even bolder schemes. He leased Madison Square Garden to a circus promoter, pocketing a hefty deposit before the renter discovered the venue's actual owners knew nothing about the deal. He sold plots of land in Central Park, complete with fake deeds bearing the forged signatures of city officials. His most brazen stunt, offering the Statue of Liberty to an out-of-town investor as a lucrative tourist concession, claiming the city was tired of managing it. The buyer backed out last minute, sparing Parker another round of legal trouble, but not before he'd cashed the earnest money check. What set Parker apart wasn't just his boldness, it was his flair for the theatrical. He didn't just forge documents, he staged entire performances, hiring actors to play city inspectors or angry, previous owners to add pressure to his deals. He understood that the more elaborate the lie, the harder it was to question. And in a rapidly growing New York, where bureaucracy was tangled and newcomers were eager to stake their claim, Parker's cons thrived on chaos. By the time victims realized they'd been had, he'd already vanished into the crowd, ready to reinvent himself for the next score. Parker's eventual downfall came not from a savvy mark, but from his own ego. After years of outrunning the law, he grew careless, repeating cons in the same neighborhoods until police finally connected the dots. Arrested and sentenced to life in Sing Sing, he became a celebrity inmate, regaling reporters with tales of his exploits. Even in prison, he couldn't resist the grift. He famously sold his jail cell to a fellow inmate for $50. His legacy endures as a darkly comic lesson in the power of pure audacity. Parker didn't just exploit the system, he exposed how fragile trust can be when faced with a convincing story and a well-dressed storyteller. In the end, his greatest con wasn't selling bridges, it was proving that with enough confidence you could sell anything, even if it was bolted firmly to the ground. Carlos Mirage didn't just sell snake oil, he sold an entire oasis, conjuring water where none existed and leaving investors clutching deeds to a desert mirage. In the scorching summer of 1874, this silver-tongued grifter rode into the Arizona territory with a plan so audacious it bordered on artistry. At a time when water was more valuable than gold, Mirage claimed to have discovered a vast underground aquifer beneath the bone-dry Sonoran desert. All he needed, he told eager settlers and speculators, was a little capital to tap into it. What followed wasn't just a scam. It was a full-blown hydrographic hoax, complete with forged surveys, staged drilling demonstrations, and a secret network of buried barrels to prove his fictional water source was real. The genius of Mirage's scheme lay in its simplicity. He'd scout remote patches of desert, then hire laborers to dig shallow wells under cover of darkness. Into these pits, his team would lower barrels filled with water hauled from distant rivers, sealing them with porous lids to create the illusion of a natural seep. When investors arrived for inspections, Mirage would dramatically pry open a well, dip a cup into the damp earth, and let them taste the proof for themselves. For added flair, he'd point to wilting plants he'd secretly watered at dawn, claiming they thrived on the aquifer's bounty. The act was so convincing that even seasoned ranchers handed over life savings for shares in his Mirage Springs Water Company, dreaming of orchards blooming in the wasteland. But Mirage's real masterstroke was paperwork. He commissioned beautifully engraved maps from a drunk Tucson cartographer, marking fictional subterranean rivers with names like Silver Vein Flow and Pioneer's Fount. These he stamped with an official-looking seal he'd fashioned from a melted belt buckle. To skeptical buyers, he'd present geological surveys filled with pseudoscientific jargon about artesian pressure and sedimentary saturation, knowing full well no one in the territory had the expertise to challenge him. When a particularly sharp-eyed banker demanded to see the water table source, Mirage staged a midnight accident, dynamiting one of his own wells and blaming saboteurs sent by competing land barons. Paranoia, he'd learned, could be as persuasive as proof. The collapse came when a group of investors hired an actual hydrologist who discovered the barrels buried beneath Mirage's wells. By then, the con artist had vanished, leaving behind empty coffers and hundreds of families staring at worthless deeds. Yet the fallout revealed something darker than greed, the desperation of people clinging to hope in a merciless landscape. Mirage hadn't just sold water, he'd sold the dream of taming the untamable, a fantasy so potent that even when the truth dried up, some still whispered about hidden rivers waiting to be found. His legacy wasn't just a cautionary tale of fraud, but a testament to the lengths we'll go to believe in salvation, even when it's poured from a barrel under the cover of night. Maria Duval didn't just predict futures, she manufactured them, transforming fear and hope into a global empire built on deceit. For over 3 decades, this so-called Baroness flooded mailboxes across the world with personalized letters claiming she alone could ward off curses, reunite lost loves, and unlock fortunes for a fee. Her operation wasn't some shadowy backroom hustle. It was a finely tuned machine, extracting nearly $200 million from desperate believers who saw her handwritten notes as lifelines. The cruel irony, the psychic insights she peddled were as generic as horoscopes, churned out by a network of ghostwriters and mailed to millions like psychic spam. The genius of Duval's scam lay in its veneer of intimacy. Victims would open their mail to find letters addressed directly to them, stamped with urgent warnings. Maria Duval has seen your aura clouded by danger. The prose dripped with faux concern, mixing flattery. Your kindness makes you a target for envy with ominous vagueness. A dark-haired man threatens your finances. Each letter came with a personalized talisman, a cheap pendant or scrap of cloth, and instructions to send cash for a full consultation. The hook, an implied promise that ignoring her could invite disaster. It was emotional blackmail disguised as cosmic guidance, preying on loneliness and superstition with surgical precision. But here's the twist: Maria Duval might not have even existed. Investigators later uncovered that the name was likely a fabrication, a front for a sprawling network of boiler rooms and printing presses across Europe and North America. The Baroness herself never met clients or penned letters. Her image, a stern, dark-haired woman in flowing robes, was stock photography. The real architects were shadowy operatives who bought mailing lists targeting the elderly, the financially struggling, and anyone who'd ever dabbled in astrology. They knew the power of repetition, too. If you ignored the first letter, a second would arrive weeks later, gaslighting. Why haven't you responded? Your hesitation is causing the negative energy to grow. The scale of the deception was staggering. At its peak, Duval's operation mailed over 60 million letters a year, translated into 14 languages. Law enforcement in multiple countries flagged her as a predator, but legal loopholes made prosecution fiendishly difficult. Because the letters never explicitly guaranteed results, they danced just outside fraud statutes. When Swiss authorities finally raided a Geneva print shop in 2016, they found warehouses stuffed with pre-written, psychic readings and bundles of cash, but no Maria. Just an empty chair where the myth had been crafted. What makes Duval's story so chilling isn't the money, it's the exploitation of trust at its most vulnerable. Her victims weren't just gullible, they were often grieving, isolated, or facing crises no rational solution could fix. In a world that feels increasingly chaotic, the idea that someone, even a stranger, could impose order is irresistible. Duval's letters offered the illusion of control, a cosmic cheat code for life's unfairness. And that's the darkest truth her scam reveals. The most potent cons don't target your wallet. They target your hunger for meaning, turning hope into a commodity that's infinitely renewable and infinitely exploitable. Her legacy isn't just fake prophecies. It's a reminder that when people are drowning, they'll clutch at any rope, even one that's frayed to nothing. Ferdinand Lopez didn't just wear a uniform, he draped himself in an entire career of valor, complete with medals he'd never earned and battles he'd never fought. This master impostor strutted into the highest echelons of 1950s Washington, D.C. as a decorated war hero, rubbing elbows with senators, advising Pentagon officials, and even testifying before Congress about combat experiences that existed only in his imagination. His audacity wasn't just in the lie, it was in the stakes. While most con artists fleece individuals, Lopez aimed higher, manipulating the very institutions designed to spot frauds like him. The act began with meticulous research. Lopez pored over military histories, memorizing troop movements and Medal of Honor citations until he could discuss them like a veteran. He tailored his persona to the moment, sometimes a hardened Pacific Theater survivor, other times a European strategist who'd helped plan D-Day. His uniform, custom made by a tailor who asked no questions, dripped with ribbons, purple hearts, silver stars, even a fictional Order of Lafayette he claimed France had bestowed. The deeper he wove his tapestry of heroism, the harder it became to question. After all, who would dare accuse a war hero of stolen valor in an era when memories of World War II were still raw? Lopez's breakthrough came when he leveraged his fabricated reputation to infiltrate veterans' organizations. These groups, eager to honor forgotten heroes, gave him platforms to speak at rallies and fundraisers. His speeches were masterpieces of emotional manipulation, tearful recollections of fallen comrades, gripping tales of narrow escapes, and rousing calls to support troops. The more he performed, the more legitimacy he gained, until invitations poured in from lawmakers seeking his expertise on defense policy, his piece de resistance. Testifying before a House subcommittee about alleged communist infiltration in the military, where he spun battlefield anecdotes so vivid, congressmen nodded along without checking his credentials. But like all grand illusions, Lopez's began to fray at the edges. A sharp-eyed clerk at the National Archives noticed discrepancies in his service records dates that didn't align with known deployments, unit numbers that had never existed. When investigators dug deeper, they found no fingerprints in any military database, no ship manifest showing his passage overseas, no comrades who recognized his face. The final blow came when a retired colonel overheard Lopez misidentifying the caliber of a standard-issue rifle, a mistake no real soldier would make. Confronted, Lopez didn't break character. He claimed his records were sealed due to classified operations, a last-ditch bluff that collapsed when prosecutors revealed he'd spent the war years working as a dishwasher in Newark. What makes Lopez's story unforgettable isn't just the scale of the deception, it's the cultural blind spot he exposed. In post-war America, where uniforms commanded instant respect, few thought to verify what lay beneath the ribbons. His cons thrived on collective guilt, the sense that perhaps heroes had been overlooked, that the system might have failed someone who deserved better. And in that space between gratitude and gullibility, Lopez didn't just fool people. He held up a mirror to their need to believe in heroes, proving that sometimes the most powerful lies are the ones we're desperate to accept as truth. From goat testicle surgeons to imaginary Saudi princes, these con artists didn't just bend the truth, they shattered it, leaving behind legacies so bizarre they rewrite our understanding of human gullibility. Whether it was Clifford Irving forging Howard Hughes' autobiography or Cassie Chadwick swindling banks by pretending to be Carnegie's daughter, each scam exposed a different facet of deception: the power of charisma, the hunger for miracles, or the blind trust we place in status and symbols. And let's not forget the sheer spectacle of it all. P.T. Barnum's Fiji mermaid, stitched together from a monkey and a fish, or John Keely's etheric force machine, a glorified pile of pipes that somehow convinced investors it could defy physics. These weren't just lies, they were full-blown performances where the audience played as big a role as the grifter. But why does America keep producing these audacious fraudsters? Look no further than the mythos of the American dream itself, a land where reinvention isn't just possible, it's celebrated. From the gold rushes to Silicon Valley, we're taught that anyone with enough grit and ingenuity can strike it rich. Con artists like Anna Delvey or Franca Bagnall didn't buck the system, they weaponized its core promise. They understood that in a culture obsessed with self-made success, the line between visionary and fraud is often just a matter of timing. Fail and you're a huckster, succeed and you're a genius, and when the stakes are that blurred, why not roll the dice? What ties these stories together isn't just the audacity of the cons, it's their lasting impact. Ponzi's name became synonymous with financial fraud. Brinkley's quackery paved the way for modern medical regulations, and the Fox sisters' spiritualist hoaxes still echo in today's wellness scams. These weren't victimless crimes, they eroded trust, shaped laws, and in some cases cost lives. Yet they also hold up a mirror to our collective weaknesses, our desperation for quick fixes, our reverence for authority, and our willingness to suspend disbelief when the story's good enough. So now it's your turn. Which of these outrageous cons left you stunned? Was it the great imposter Demara performing surgeries with a medical manual, or Tania Head hijacking the grief of 9/11 survivors? Drop your pick in the comments, and remember, the next time something seems too good to be true, it probably is. But hey, that's what makes the game so tempting, isn't it? After all, in a world where perception is everything, the best cons aren't the ones that fool you, they're the ones that make you want to believe.